huge pleasure to introduce Professor Hal Pawson today. We're doing a LHG experiment in that we're going straight to podcasts rather than kind of grapple with the time difference between the UK and Australia. So Hal is Professor of Housing Research and Policy at UNSW City Futures Research Centre in Sydney. Hal's previously worked at Heriot-Watt, the GLC, London Research Centre, and where I know him from, Hackney. Also, Hal's written or co-authored numerous books. So a quick Google search will show you the books that Hal's authored. So looking forward to a fascinating discussion that follows on from the one we had with Wendy Hayhurst and Jessie Taylor a couple of weeks ago. We specifically want to pick over lessons from the Australian election as far as housing is concerned. But first of all, Hal, could you develop the Australian housing context for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much for inviting me, and nice to be talking to Labour Housing Group people. The Australian housing system in some ways has some great similarities with the UK, and others is very, very different. Probably the similarities are that we have a kind of a problem of housing affordability or housing unaffordability that's been building up for a long time. We've got rising rates of rental stress in the lower end of the private rental market. We've got homelessness is a significant issue here as well. It's probably a little bit more moderate than in the UK, but it's certainly a problem that is growing. So, you can see a few tented encampments around some of our major cities now, which is quite a new thing, but quite a shocking thing, really. So some of the big differences are that the biggest one, for which will be mainly of interest to a lot of people on this call probably, is we have very little social housing. We have a social housing sector, but it's 4% of all housing, not 16 or 17 that it is in the UK. Historically, it was a bit higher. It's never been anywhere near where the UK is, even now, but it's been drifting down for 30 years or so. And therefore, it's a sector which is extremely residualized. To get a tenancy, you need to have an extremely high level of housing need, way above what would be, familiar in Britain. So that is a significant difference. So maybe we can. Shall I go on to maybe back to you, Andy, and you can move the conversation on.
Okay, so this is this kind of starting point. We've now got a second term of an Australian Labour government, which has cheered us all up after some pretty disastrous election results. So as we find in Labour in power is tough. So do you want to talk us through some of the good things and some of the challenges of the Australian Labour Party have experienced?
Sure, yeah. Well, housing was certainly a really big debating point in the election, Labour's won a surprisingly emphatic victory. So that it went right in various ways. Housing almost certainly was not the decisive issue, but it was helpful, and it was, as I say, it was pretty central in the campaign. But maybe before I sort of go into that, just to say a little bit more about, I think you need to know a little bit about what's happened in the first Labour term. So we only have a 3-year term of federal parliament here. So Labour won an election in 2022, and that term of government has just ended. In that 3 years, there was a huge ramp up of housing policy activism, if you like, from the federal government, because the previous 9 years had been what we call the coalition, which is essentially the conservative side of politics. And really, there had been a national housing policy only around home ownership. All of the previous, the previous limited programs for social and affordable housing were terminated during that time. So Labour came in 2022, restarted some national activity, so a national social and affordable housing investment program. Also initiated some other significant changes around, firstly, introduced a national shared equity first home buyer program. And the third element of legislation in the last 3 years was a bill to restructure the tax arrangements for build to rent housing, market build to rent, which was another thing which was again another thing or form of housing which is not popular with the conservative side of politics in Australia. So from that start, let's go back to how housing featured in the election. Both of the main parties, Labour and the Coalition, which is a Liberal and national parties working together, both major parties launched their election campaigns in April. And the centrepiece announcement of both parties was housing. On the Labour side, that was two things really. One was to extend the eligibility for a first home buyer mortgage guarantee scheme beyond. There was already something that was being offered to quite a lot of people, around about a third of all first home buyers, but they've removed the income limits entirely from that now. So there's no income limitation on the ability to go to the government's National Housing Agency and sign up to get to be able to get, or to enable you to get a mortgage on a 5% deposit, not 20. So that was the first announcement, which I think was probably very electorally resonant, probably quite helpful to Labour's electoral standing. It did come under quite a lot of criticism for being yet another demand side subsidy in a way. It's a demand side assistance. It isn't really a subsidy. A mortgage guarantee is a fairly thin form of assistance, but nevertheless, it's on the demand side of the market. So there is some inflationary impact, and there was quite a lot of negative comment from the commentariat as a result of that. However, my own view is it's only a fairly mildly inflationary thing. The second announcement that Labour revealed at the campaign launch was, in my opinion, a much bigger one, much more significant one, which was the plan to work with the state and territory governments to build 100,000 homes over 8 years, ring-fenced to first-home buyers only. So this is government coming back into the space of commissioning housing from from private builders, yes, but commissioned by government directly, and the implication being that it will be that these homes will be sold to first home buyers only at the cost price, I think, at the cost of construction, which will mean a significant discount on the market price. I think we can assume, and I mean this is something which Australia has seen before in the past, but a long time ago. In the immediate post-war period, in the 1950s and 1960s, build for sale is something that some state governments anyway, did on at quite some scale, and it helped to push home ownership up quite fast in the first 20 or 30 years after World War II. Then they completely withdrew from that. and there was no more, that level of intervention has kind of, most people have forgotten that that ever happened. So that's quite a big, I think, move towards direct housing provision, which Australia hasn't seen for a long time. So that's the Labour side. On the coalition side, their big announcement was I'd say also a pretty high ambition. They said that if the coalition wins power, we will introduce mortgage tax relief for first home buyers. Now, this is something which has never existed in Australia. Yes, it exists for the landlords, of course. It's a major source of tax concessions for landlords, but it's never been there for owner occupiers. Unlike in the UK, which where many of us breathed a sigh of relief when it was phased out in 2000. But the great idea from the coalition is, let's bring this in. Let's make let's offer something that is quite a juicy offer for first home buyers. And indeed, it certainly attracted a lot of attention. Probably, and I think initially Labour felt really quite worried that it was going to be a very attractive offer from, especially for certain geographies, the outer suburbs of the Australian cities, where that was the kind of battleground of this last election. And maybe it did help to shore up the coalition a little bit, but evidently it wasn't very successful because the coalition was being smashed in this election. That maybe partly it had less effect than you would expect, because it was hugely criticised in the media by economists. Just about, there were very few people to other than the party. The party faithful, who were willing to support this idea of a new tax concession for first home buyers, on top of pretty juicy tax concessions that already exist for private landlords and owner occupiers already.
I think so. If we can pick at some of this, so hopefully all the people who watch this are going to be Labour supporters, and we're not going to reveal any weaknesses. But the idea of mortgage income tax relief would be very popular in this country with the Daily Mail and the Express, and there'd be a kind of whole narrative about the hard-pressed middle class finally being given help by governments, and that didn't happen in Australia.
Not very much, no, because I think there was no clarity about how it was going to be funded. There wasn't even clarity about what the cost of it was going to be. There was a confusion about whether there were some numbers that were given, but there was a confusion about whether this was a 1-year cost or what we call the forward estimates cost, which is 4 years. I mean, so if you can't even be clear about that, it sounds like the policy hasn't really been thought through very well. So yeah, it was badly presented, and that didn't inspire confidence, even among the media outlets who you would normally expect to be rooting for the coalition. And they had some very strong support from the Murdoch press, in particular, which is very powerful in Australia, or it has a big share of the media market, or the old style media market. I mean, it didn't go down brilliantly, even in that sphere.
Okay, and to pick at Labour's policy, so homes for sale at cost price, is this involving subsidy or is this involving planning powers?
Well, there's a $10 billion price attached, or price tag attached to this. That's the costing that that Labour announced. What they've said is that 2 billion of that will be a grant, effectively, to, I think, to state governments to help them to help them with the development, the initial development costs. There will also be 8 billion, which will be a concessional loan that, you know, they'll be expected to be repaid. So the exact terms upon which recipients, beneficiaries, first home buyers would be buying these homes wasn't actually specified, and nobody really pushed them very hard to say. Just the fact that these would be homes which could only be sold to first home buyers, just that fact was good enough for a lot of the media to say, well, this sounds like something which is is attractive, or would be attractive from the first home buyer perspective.
So, so just to understand the kind of quantum, because obviously the argument over here is how much subsidy there's going to be to build social homes. So, $2 billion in pounds is how much?
Is £1 billion. It's almost 2 to 1 at the moment. So yeah, it's not a gigantic amount of money.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there was enough. I think from my perspective, it's really quite important to bear in mind that this policy is being proposed by a government which is trying to stay in power, which is bidding for another term of government. So this policy will certainly have been developed with the full power that you have when you can ask the Treasury, all of your capable public servants in Treasury, to work out how this policy is going to function, how it's going to be paid for, how it's going to be structured, all of the costings. So I would be pretty confident that this has been properly planned, and it hopefully will not fall apart when they start trying to roll it out. I think one of the problems that the coalition had is that coming from opposition, they have less capacity to fully work through any new policy in any area, including housing, which is, of course, often very complex. So I think that's one reason why it may be that the mortgage tax relief policy and some other policies which the coalition also put out at the election, which I'll maybe come on to in a minute, were perhaps very thin and started to fall apart a bit, even when there would be even under questioning that you get in an election campaign.
Yeah, I'd like to return to this, but I just want to pick it. So the idea of getting 100,000 start homes at cost price for £1 billion, it sounds really attractive, and I'm sure that.
Well, it's 5 billion, Andy, because it's 10. The whole program is $10 billion.
Oh right, okay, yeah.
2 billion in grants, 8 billion in concessional loans. But the point is that this is going to be a cost recovery exercise. This isn't selling to people who can't afford to. This is selling to people at a price which, at the very least, will cover the construction cost. So the long-term cost of a program like this is the same as a program like Help to Buy. It's nil, because you're putting the money up front, yes, but you do expect to get it back in future. So it's not like it can't be easily compared with the cost of a social housing program, for example, where you need to provide housing at a price which is affordable to people who can't afford the cost of what it what it costs you to build the houses and buy the land. So it's a little bit different to that.
So applying this lesson to this country, which is what one of the things we need to do. So this could be a supplementary program to the social housing program. So as you say, it's a way of kind of helping first-time buyers. So in Australia, is it going to help people on medium incomes, or is it going to help people on higher incomes, or need to roll it out and see how it works?
I think we can assume that there will be income limits. I think we can assume that it won't be open to anyone who says, well, I've never owned a home before. I'd like to benefit from this. We don't know any of that yet, but I think you can assume that. I mean, for example, that our shared equity programme, the National Shared Equity Programme that was legislated by Labour in its first term, that there are income limits there that you need to be below those limits in order to qualify. So it probably is going to have some kind of guardrails around it.
So in conversation that Wendy and Jesse did, they started to tell us about the appalling problems still faced by Aboriginal people, and you also talked about the homelessness problem and the tented areas outside Australian cities, which I know we're not yet seeing in New Zealand, but people talk a lot about kind of hidden homelessness and putting people living in garages. Is there a program to deal with the people in the most intense housing need in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, there are programs. They may be rather inadequate. But just if we can just finish on the first home ownership, I'll come back to that. But I think when you say, well, what kind of relevance could that have in the UK? And I think it's probably the kind of thing that Labour's imagining will be delivered through the proposed new towns might well include some government commissioned housing for sale as well as for rent. I don't know. Speaking from a long distance. Right, I'm speaking from a long distance away, but I think the the post-war generation of new towns certainly included a lot of homes that were built for sale, and I imagine that at least some of that was directly commissioned by government rather than just entirely a kind of market operation. So I think probably this kind of what the Albanese government is proposing to do with its 100,000 homes for first home buyers, there is some kind of read across to perhaps the kind of model that you would expect to be part of this new town programme that the Starmer government is planning to roll out. But yes, I'm happy to come back to the question of people at the lower end of the housing market, and what's in it for them. Well, unfortunately, in this election, nothing new really, nothing new from Labour, nothing new from the coalition. Now, Labour's got a stronger argument here, or a stronger excuse, a much stronger excuse, because quite a lot of what Labour's done over the last 3 years has been setting up a national social and affordable housing investment programme that is, the first programme of its kind for 15 or 20 years. And that is the kind of output of that is just beginning to flow through now. At the beginning of the sort of second term of the Albanese government, I think Labour sort of felt, well, we don't really. We're quite justified in saying, well, we're not offering anything new at the moment on that because our offer is simply The coalition, on the other hand, programs, their offer was without any equivocation, the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is the kind of vehicle for Labour's programme, we're going to scrap that. We're going to, end it ASAP. Although there were no new offers made on social and affordable housing at the election, the outcome of the election was very important for federal government activity in that space. As far as other programs are concerned, or as far as other ways in which the state tries to assist people on very low incomes and in difficult housing situations or homeless, yes, there are programs. There is both federal and state expenditure on homelessness emergency accommodation and housing advice and other forms of housing assistance, which for a few people might lead to a social housing tenancy, but for most it won't, because there's so little social housing available. Mm-hmm. So yes, we do. There is such provision, but it doesn't have any statutory basis like the Homeless Persons Act in the UK. It is, and it's also, those services are mainly provided not by government at all, not even by local government, but by not-for-profit, often faith-based agencies that provide that are funded by mainly by state governments and provide emergency housing and advice or other kinds of assistance for people who are in that situation. And yes, it could lead to a social housing tenancy for a few of those people, but not for most of them.
So one thing that might look different in Australia is the role of the state government. So we're constantly told that in the UK we've got the most centralised power making in the developed world. So are the state governments more kind of influential in Australia?
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, this is another huge difference between the two countries, which I should have mentioned at the beginning. The governance arrangement might, on the surface, look similar. Okay, there's two main layers of government. It's the federal government and the states, and a couple of territories. Whereas in England, for example, it's Westminster and local government. But the distribution of powers, responsibilities between those two levels of government in Australia was completely different from the way it works in the UK. Basically, the federal government doesn't have legal authority over state governments when it comes to housing activities. Completely different from Britain, where the UK government can legislate and more or less, instruct local government to undertake, to deliver certain programs or to sell off council houses at a certain level of discount, for example. Or indeed to assist homeless people, in a defined way. Those kind of powers don't exist in Australia. So the primary level of government to provide housing services in Australia is the states and the territories, and that historically that has kind of often provided a sort of get out clause for federal governments that are not well disposed towards social welfare. In other words, the right of politics, the coalition parties, when they are in power, their usual position or their usual sort of stated policy is, well, it isn't really our job to run social housing or to fund social housing or to lead national housing policy at all. We believe in home ownership, and we will voluntarily initiate or fund some programs to assist first home buyers, but social housing is not our job legally, and the the states will have to, if you state governments want to, to be more active in that space, good luck, go ahead, but you'll need to mostly pay for it yourselves. So it's a very, very different
sorry, Helen, the states have got
distribution of those powers.
Oh, we've lost the connection.
So do you want to start again?
Start again. Well, not start again. We just lost the last bit of that. But just in terms of aiding people's understanding, do the states have tax raising powers? So if the state wanted to run a social housing place.
Yeah, well, the states do have some tax raising powers, but they do not have anywhere near the financial firepower that the federal government does. So we have what the economists call vertical fiscal imbalance. In other words, which you have in the UK as well, which is the fact that central government has far greater power to raise tax and borrow good rates, but it's which is mainly responsible for delivering these services.
Okay, thanks. Well, the other thing we touched on is
sorry. I think we got interrupted. I think we're back on. I think we're back in.
Yeah, your link's breaking up over here, Hal. I don't know if I'm breaking up there.
You come back. You've come back now.
I'm back. Okay. An area we said we'd return to is the very short 3-year terms in Australia and the difficulties of the opposition trying to devise policy. So I think you were involved in trying to help the Labour government before it got into power. Do you want to talk about how that kind of policy development work outside government works?
Well, yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think the British Labour Party is, or the current housing minister, when he was in opposition, I know from my British colleagues that there was significant consultation, significant interaction with at least some housing academics in prior to Starmer winning the election. Well, we had almost none of that. Before Albanese came to power in 2022, it was pretty much a kind of fait accompli set of policies that Labour went to the 2022 election with. Myself, and I don't think there were any other academic colleagues who had any greater input than I did, which was none, into that, into the policy development ahead of the 2022 election, which was a bit unfortunate, but it was a reasonable. It was incoherent as a list. It didn't have much. It didn't have a very clear sort of connectivity, but the commitments that were made were okay in themselves, and they were deliverable with some difficulty. But all of Labour's the commitments that they went into the 2022 election with were delivered in some shape or form by the end of the 2022 Parliament, in other words, by now, except for one, which unfortunately is, in my opinion, the most important. There was a commitment in the 2022 election platform, as they call it in this country, not manifesto. The election platform said, we will also develop a national housing and homelessness plan. In other words, a national housing strategy, which Of course, if it was done well, of course, it may turn out to be a complete dud. But the idea, in my opinion, is highly creditable and absolutely necessary. Sadly, they did work on it. It didn't disappear immediately or anything like that. They worked on it, but towards the end of the term of government, it disappeared from view, and no public statement has been made about whether it is buried or whether it may come back in this new term of government. So that is a big disappointment, I think. And we kind of keep our fingers crossed that maybe it will re-emerge in this term of Parliament, and hopefully some of us might have an opportunity to have a bit of an input to it, which was pretty minimal in the development work that was done in the first term. But just to go back to the point about the 3-year term, that is also really important as a limiting factor to what Australian federal governments can do in a whole, across a whole range of areas, but especially in housing, where there's such a long lead-in time to get a program going and to actually generate anything out of it. A 3-year term is incredibly constraining it has been incredibly constraining for housing, especially because there was a kind of there was a blockage in Labour getting housing legislation through Parliament in the first term, because Labour doesn't have a majority in the upper house, the Senate, and you have to get the Senate to approve any act of Parliament that's coming through with a majority in the lower house. And the result of that is that the coalition, in other words, the right side of politics, and the Greens, who are pretty much on the left, they combined to block Labour's housing legislation. All 3 major Labour housing bills that were attempted in the first term of government, they all went through eventually, because the Greens eventually gave in. But the Greens, in an attempt to extract concessions or to make these policies bigger, and good on the Greens for wanting to do that, but they went much too far, and they held up these programs for 6, 8, 12 months. And when you've only got a 3-year term of government, that's really damaging, and that really made it hard to get sort of significant product on the ground at the end of the 3 years. And the other thing, which is a huge sort of governance structure problem or limitation for the housing minister in the Australian federal government, is there's no Department of Housing. The minister has her own, office, and she has her own, political appointees, her own team, but she doesn't have a department who are, her property, or, people who are only answerable to her. She has to for the kind of civil service backup that the federal housing minister has is split between 2 departments, neither of which she runs. They're split between the Treasury, and we have the Treasurer, equivalent of your Chancellor of the Exchequer. They're his team, but some of them have they're in a housing division, and then there's the Department of Social Services, and again they report to their minister, and they're not primarily responsible to the housing minister. So the housing minister is at a big disadvantage that she doesn't have that bureaucratic or officialdom backup behind her, and these are big constraints, I think.
So Hal, you talked about delivery and the problems, the obvious problem of delivering within 3 years. Can we go back to the 100,000 start homes that have been obsessing me a bit?
Yeah.
Do you think they'll be delivered, or significantly delivered, or the lead-in period's just too long?
Well, what Labour has said is that the first of these will be built during 26-27. So by the 30th of June 2027, which is, sounds a long way away, but actually that's probably quite ambitious. I think the expectation will be that at least the first tranche of these homes will be built on land that is already owned by government. Probably already owned by state government, or maybe local governments, or maybe even the federal government, although most of the federal government's land holdings are not really well located for housing of any kind. So yes, it's quite, the hope would be that this would start to deliver significantly before the next election, which we would be expecting in, the early part of 2028. But not very much before that. And then from that point on, the commitment is that this 100,000 is a number which would accumulate over 8 years, so around 12,500 per year. And all of this is contributing towards a bigger aim, which the Albanese government committed to during its first term of government, which is very similar to the Starmer aim, which is the overall house building number, which is kind of based on this idea that housing is unaffordable because we're not building enough of it. So very much the same mantra or stated argument is, well, we have to build more. We need to set ourselves a target. And Australian governments, the federal government, the Albanese government, brought together the state and territory governments in 2022 and came to a sort of signed and a solemn undertaking that between us, we will try to enable 1.2 million homes to be built over 5 years. And this new commitment of 100,000 homes for first-home buyers, the first tranche of that will contribute a little bit towards the aim of building this 1.2 million. So the same big housing policy that the Starmer government has embraced is also one of the kind of main themes of the housing policy of the first Albanese term, which I should have mentioned earlier and didn't get around to talking about until now. But the same thinking is there, that primarily we can make this happen by streamlining planning. Ever heard that one before? I think it's a pretty common.
You know where my question's going to go, because this is of critical importance. Is it working? Is it working?
Well, I would say hardly at all at this stage. Not necessarily. It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad aspiration to, have a very hard look at all of our planning processes and our zoning rules, which is the way we do planning in Australia, and decide whether we really need them all to be as demanding or restrictive as they are. That's fine. Let's, being for the highest level of government to be saying, we think you ought to do this. It doesn't have any legal power to force you to do it, as I said before, but it can encourage it. It's no bad thing, but you cannot bring about a surge in house building when market conditions do not encourage it or do not allow it. And at the moment, we're in the same part of the housing market cycle that you're in, that we've had an unprecedented increase in construction costs in the last 3 years, since the end of COVID, really. Construction costs at 30 or 40% in unit terms higher than they were in 2020. And the value of apartments in particular has not risen by enough to make that form of construction viable, or at least expanding it is something that we cannot do. So there's in fact a huge pipeline of planning approved apartment development projects which are not starting, which are waiting until the market conditions enable that to happen, until enough of those homes can be sold off the plan at a price which the builder thinks is the sort of minimum that they can offer, to convince the bank to say, okay, we're happy now to advance you the development funding that you need, the loans that you need to develop, that would enable that to get off the ground. So no, streamlining planning, yes, let's do as much of that as we can, but it can't guarantee that there's a kind of a surge of development which is liberated, because the only thing holding builders and developers back is these blasted planners and their unnecessary restrictions. That is, that's an impediment to development, but it is not the only thing, not in the current phase of the market cycle. So as interest rates are beginning to drop, which they are in Australia just as they are in the UK, as the construction cost inflation has dropped right back down to almost zero now. We've gone way past that sort of peak. The construction costs are not falling, but they're no longer rising. They're not. I think they're even below this level of CPI now. So there is some prospect that the conditions are going to improve, so that any relaxation in planning, in the demandingness of planning, will kind of enable some acceleration of house building over the next 2 or 3 years.
Hal, you've naturally brought me to my final question, and people who listen to the podcast won't forgive me if I don't ask this question. So I know you're a very close watcher of what happens in the UK, and particularly what the Labour government are doing. So how do you think we've started, and how do we kind of kick on from here?
Where do we start? There ain't no money. I mean, it's the biggest issue, isn't it? I think the thing which I feel is perhaps the most significant among the housing related commitments that were part of the manifesto, and which is being progressed. Okay, planning reform, maybe that could help if market conditions improve, but more significant than that, it seems to me, is the review of compulsory purchase. The terms on which government can acquire developable land, and the possibility of restoring something like the rules that were in place in the 1950s and early 1960s, which really have to, which I think if you don't do that, new towns are not going to work. No, the reason why it's been very difficult various efforts have been made to encourage or to bring about a new generation of new towns. Gordon Brown tried it. George Osborne said Ebbsfleet is going to be huge. Well, it hasn't really worked. And that's because the conditions for the state to enable new towns the new town model to work in the early post-war period don't exist anymore, because we changed. Or with the UK, I say we still, because I still consider myself a Brit. The compulsory purchase terms it don't make it possible for government to buy land at agricultural prices, develop it, and then sell it at the market price, and use the proceeds to pay for the infrastructure. That's the model. And I'm hoping that the government is sufficiently, knows what it's doing when it says we're going to review the terms, the compulsory purchase rules, and is sufficiently ambitious to to push through some significant change, which will enable land to be acquired for social housing in particular at a price which makes the cost of production significantly less than it is now, because it's the land that is the that's the part of the cost of provision which has increased disproportionately over decades, both in Australia and in the UK. Yes, construction costs are higher as well, yeah, but it's land which has become a huge limiting factor.
That's really interesting, Hal. So, one of the kind of priorities for the incoming Labour government's been to start and develop a national plan, pushing regional plans and local plans. So, shamefully, a lot of councils don't have a local plan at the moment, which I think is absolutely right. Yeah, we are working on compulsory purchase, and I think for the reasons you say, we're going to have to follow this through. I think the first time we do, it's going to be explosive, because
I think I mean, it's still kind of below the parapet, isn't it? It's not something that the Daily Mail has sort of discovered yet, I think. And yes, if it's going to have any impact, it's going to be quite challenging, because it's talking about property rights, and the same is true of the right to buy, and that being wound back in some degree, jolly good thing, but those kind of moves are highly liable to trigger court challenges, I would say. And we hope that the government gets its legal advice straight in the way that it sets these things up before it commits to something that would be tested in court.
So trusting that this podcast will have fairly limited circulation beyond Labour members, but one of the really effective things that we've done very early is that we've reduced right to buy discount in London from memory, I think 138,000 down to about 16,000. So a huge reduction in the discount, which will test out whether people kind of genuinely want to buy the property, and that's attracted virtually zero publicity. So far.
Well, that's interesting, because that used to be a third rail that you couldn't touch.
Yeah. Yes.
And I know. Okay, the Blair government did something similar. Well, I think probably thanks to John Prescott, something similar to impose limits on maximum discount levels, I think, wasn't it? Anyway, that had a huge impact on the rate of sales in the early 2000s, I seem to remember. So that certainly sounds like a positive move.
So a final question, and it's a crisis I know is going to be close to your heart, having worked in Hackney, but the crisis of council housing funding has absolutely come to bear. So councils have got an aging stock. Obviously, Grenfell's kind of had a traumatic effect on all of us. So desperate need for investment, and then that kind of conflicts with your starting statement of there ain't no money. So if you got any advice for us?
It's really hard to see how a lot of headway can be made in this space, other than through repurposing existing social housing that is past its sell-by date, perhaps, but at least occupies land which could be redeveloped at much higher density. I'm sorry to say that that's not a pleasant prospect for tenants. It's also something that takes quite a long time to deliver, and it has all kinds of political challenges along the way. But unless you've got unless the tax revenue is substantially increased, by the UK government, it's hard to see that social housing can expect to get a significantly larger share of the current revenue, of current government revenue. I hope it happens, but it's not a very electorally appealing thing. Form of sort of program for activity, and I think looking to the system itself to try to squeeze more value out of quote unquote lazy assets. I'm sorry, this is using horribly neoliberal kind of terms, but and central government, the UK government has to grasp the nettle actually to put in some more revenue raising measures. The commitments that were made to no tax increases that affect working people were just extravagant, ridiculously extravagant. And the opportunities that have been presented to walk away from those by the fact that there have been some completely unpredicted world events have not been taken yet, but they jolly well should be. And taxing, well, a wealth tax may be something that's impossible, but the capital gains tax is a form of wealth tax, and that already exists. It's not a new thing. Just altering the capital gains tax so that it's paid at the same rate as income tax, that's a no-brainer. And I don't know, exactly how many billions that would raise, but quite a significant amount of money. And I think the UK, just as Australia, needs to anyway think about ways of transitioning revenue raising away from incomes and towards wealth.
Yeah.
And it will be beneficial it'll be beneficial for the housing system as well, to discourage overinvestment in housing, which is one of the damaging causes of housing unaffordability.
Hal, that is just such a brilliant way of ending this podcast. So I knew you were going to be great, but you've kind of exceeded my expectations. So huge thanks, and hopefully we can work our magic and give this podcast the circulation it deserves. Okay, thanks, Josh.
Good to talk, Andy. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.